They burned his barn over a lie, and by sundown, the man who told it couldn't hold his hands still. The smoke was still rising when the wind shifted, carrying the scent of charred wood across the dry stretch of land where Elias Turner stood without moving, boots planted in blackened dirt, eyes fixed on what used to be shelter, what used to be quiet, what used to be his life before a rumor turned into certainty in the mouths of men who never bothered to ask. The boards had fallen inward, not from force, but from surrender, like the whole place had simply given up trying to stand against people who had already made up their minds. A warped beam creaked softly as it settled, the only sound in a space that should have been full of horses, of breath, of low, restless movement. Now there was only heat fading into ash and a silence that pressed harder than any accusation ever could. Elias didn't kneel, didn't reach into the debris, didn't call out a single word. He just stood there, one hand hanging loose at his side, the other holding something small, something darkened by fire. A piece of metal, bent, familiar. He turned it slowly between his fingers, watching how the last light of the afternoon caught along its edge like it still remembered what it used to be. Behind him, the town of Dust Hollow carried on as if nothing had happened. A few doors creaked open. A few voices murmured low. No one came closer than the fence line. Not after what they'd already done. Not after what they'd told themselves he was. It had started that morning, fast and certain, like all bad things do when they're built on something people want to believe. Caleb Voss had ridden in just after sunrise, dust on his coat, urgency in his voice, telling anyone who would listen that Elias Turner had been hiding Apache riders on his land, that he'd been feeding them, guiding them, betraying his own kind for reasons no one could quite explain, but everyone was ready to accept. No proof, no witness, just a man with the right tone and the right fear in his eyes. And fear spreads quicker than truth ever could. By mid-morning, the whispers had turned into decisions. By noon, decisions turned into action. No court, no question, just a gathering of men who believed they were doing something necessary. They hadn't looked Elias in the eye when they came, hadn't asked him to speak. They just worked, methodical and quiet, as if the act itself justified the reason behind it. And Elias, he hadn't stopped them. Not because he agreed, not because he was afraid, but because somewhere deep in the way he watched them, there was a patience that didn't match the moment, a stillness that made one or two men hesitate before turning away. Now, hours later, that same stillness remained. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that stretched across the land like fingers reaching for something they couldn't quite touch. Elias finally moved, just once, bending down with slow care and brushing aside a layer of ash until something caught beneath his hand. A chain, thin, silver once. He lifted it, and at the end of it, a small pendant, half melted, its shape warped but not erased. His thumb ran across its surface, tracing a pattern only he seemed to recognize. For a moment, his eyes closed, not in grief, not in anger, but in memory. Snow, breath in the cold, a voice he didn't understand, and then did. He opened his eyes again, and the wind shifted once more. This time, it carried something else. Distant, rhythmic, too steady to be chance. Elias didn't turn right away. He didn't need to. The ground beneath his boots told him enough. One rider, maybe you could mistake. Two, you could ignore. But this had weight. This had intention. Far out beyond the ridge, a thin line of dust began to rise, catching the last gold of the sun as it climbed higher, thicker, moving with purpose. In town, someone noticed. Then another. A door shut. Another opened. The murmurs returned, but sharper now, uncertain. Elias straightened, the pendant still in his hand, the chain slipping through his fingers like time finally catching up to something that had been waiting far longer than anyone realized. He didn't reach for a weapon, didn't call for help. He just stood there, facing the horizon, as the sound grew clearer, closer, undeniable. And somewhere behind him, in the center of Dust Hollow, Caleb Voss stepped out onto the street, squinting into the light, his jaw tightening just slightly, his hand lifting without thinking toward the brim of his hat before. Stopping halfway, as if something inside him had already begun to understand what was coming and what it meant. The sound did not rush in all at once. It built slowly, like something deliberate choosing when to be heard, each hoofbeat falling into place with the next until the rhythm became impossible to ignore, steady as a heartbeat that did not belong to any one man, but to something larger moving as a single will across open land. And by the time the first shapes crested the ridge, the entire town of Dust Hollow had gone quiet in a way that did not feel natural. Conversations cut short, tools set down. Mid-task, even the wind seemed to hesitate as if it understood what was arriving carried a weight no one there had prepared for. Elias Turner remained where he stood, the charred ground beneath him still warm, the broken chain resting in his palm, his gaze fixed forward as the riders came into view one by one, then 10, then more, until the line stretched wide enough to cast its own shadow across the fading light of day. They did not hurry. They did not scatter. They moved in formation that spoke of discipline learned over years, of silence chosen rather than imposed, each horse stepping with calm precision as though they had all agreed long before reaching this place that speed was not what mattered. It was presence. It was certainty. At the edge of town, a few men shifted their weight, hands hovering near their belts out of habit more than intention, but no one drew anything, no one called out, because there was something in the way those riders approached that made sudden movement feel like a mistake waiting to happen. Caleb Voss felt it before he understood it, a tightening in his chest that did not come from fear alone, but from recognition without memory, like hearing a name you had once known spoken from far away. And he took one step forward into the street, then stopped, his boots scraping lightly against the dust as he squinted toward the approaching line, trying to count, trying to make sense of why there were so many and why none of them seemed uncertain about where they were going. The lead rider broke from the formation just enough to move ahead, not as a show of authority, but as a quiet signal that the rest would follow without question. And as that distance closed, the details began to sharpen, the cut of clothing, the markings that caught the light, the posture of someone who did not need to prove anything because it was already understood. Elias shifted his hand slightly, letting the pendant fall fully into his grip. And for the first time since the fire, there was something in his expression that changed, not relief, not anger, but a recognition that mirrored the one Caleb could not place, as if two separate lines of memory had just found where they crossed. The riders reached the outer fence and stopped as one, no shouted command, no raised hand, just a shared pause that rippled through them like breath held and released together, and the horses settled without resistance, their heads lowering slightly, their stillness as complete as the men who sat above them. No one spoke, not from the town, not from the riders. The space between them filled with a tension that did not demand action, but waited for truth to step forward on its own. The lead rider dismounted slowly, boots touching the ground with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and for a moment the figure stood there without moving, letting the distance close not with steps, but with presence, until finally the last few yards were crossed, and the line between the two worlds became something you could stand on. Elias did not move to meet them. He did not need to. The rider approached until they stood close enough that the details could no longer be mistaken, and when the figure lifted their gaze fully, there was no challenge in it, no accusation, only a depth that carried years inside it, years that had not been wasted or forgotten. Behind them, the rest of the riders remained mounted, unmoving, their attention fixed not on the town, but on the space between Elias and the one who had stepped forward, as if whatever happened next had already been decided, and they were there only to witness it. Caleb swallowed, the motion dry and slow, his eyes darting from the riders to Elias and back again, searching for something he could use, some explanation he could speak before anyone else had the chance, but the words would not come, because for the first time since morning he realized that this was not his story to control, not anymore, and the lie he had carried so easily just hours before now felt heavier with every passing second, as if the silence itself was pressing it down until it could no longer stand upright. Elias finally opened his hand, revealing the broken pendant fully, the metal catching the last line of sunlight as it hung there between them, and the rider's gaze dropped to it, just for a moment, before lifting again, and in that single exchange something passed between them that no one else in Dust Hollow could read, but everyone could feel, like the air shifting just before a storm changes direction. No one in Dust Hollow understood what had just been said, because nothing had been spoken, and yet the weight of it settled over the street like a truth that had been waiting longer than any of them had been willing to listen, the kind of truth that did not need volume, only presence, and the kind that made men look at their own hands without knowing why. The woman standing before Elias finally moved, not forward, not back, but down, her fingers reaching slowly to the small pouch at her side, and from it, she drew something wrapped in worn cloth, something handled often enough that the edges had softened with time rather than frayed. She did not rush as she unfolded it, did not look at the town, did not acknowledge the dozens of eyes fixed on her every motion, because whatever this moment was, it did not belong to them. It belonged to the space between her and Elias. When the cloth opened fully, a second pendant lay revealed, whole where his was broken, its shape unmistakable now that the two halves had been seen together, and for the first time a murmur moved through the town, low and uncertain, like people beginning to sense that something they had believed without question was about to be replaced by something they could not easily deny. Elias stepped forward then, just one step, the ash shifting under his boot, and he held out his hand without a word, not offering, not demanding, simply allowing the space between them to close on its own terms. The woman placed the intact pendant into his palm, and when the two pieces came together, the match was exact, not perfect in shape anymore, but perfect in meaning, like something that had been separated by time rather than mistake. Caleb Voss felt the shift before anyone turned to look at him, felt it in the way the silence changed direction, no longer centered on Elias, no longer questioning, but moving, slowly, inevitably, toward the one man who had given the town its reason to act. He opened his mouth once, then closed it, the words drying before they could take shape, because whatever explanation he might have offered that morning now sounded thin even in his own head, and the confidence he had worn like a coat began to slip at the edges. Someone near the general store glanced at him, then another, not accusing yet, but no longer certain either, and that uncertainty spread in a way far more dangerous than the fear he had relied on before. The woman lifted her gaze from the pendant and finally looked past Elias, her eyes moving across the town with a calm that did not challenge, did not threaten, but did not yield either, and when her voice came it was quiet enough that people had to lean into it to hear, which only made it carry further. She spoke his name first, Elias Turner, not as a question but as recognition, and then she spoke again, slowly, choosing each word as if it mattered that they be understood exactly as intended, telling them that years ago, in a winter that had taken more than it gave, a man had found her where the snow ran deeper than her strength, had lifted her when she could not stand, had given her warmth when the cold had already begun to claim what it wanted, and had asked for nothing in return, not a name, not a promise, not even a reason. The town listened without interrupting, because there was something in the way she spoke that did not invite doubt, and because the proof of it rested in Elias's hand where the two pieces of the pendant now lay joined. She did not raise her voice when she spoke of honor, did not sharpen it when she spoke of truth. She simply let the words settle where they would, and one by one the people of Dust Hollow began to understand that what they had burned had not been betrayal, but the home of a man who had done something none of them had taken the time to see. Caleb took a step back without meaning to, his heel catching slightly in the dust, and the small sound drew more attention than any shout could have, because it broke the rhythm of the moment in a way that felt wrong, like a note played out of place in a song everyone else had finally begun to hear. Elias closed his hand around the pendant, not tightly, not as if he feared losing it, but as if acknowledging that what it represented had never truly left. And when he looked up again, it was not at the riders, not at the town, but at Caleb, and there was no anger in his expression, no demand for anything to be returned, only a steadiness that made it impossible to hide behind anything that was not real. The riders remained where they were, still mounted, still silent, their presence no longer a question of what they might do, but a reminder of why they had come, and in that stillness the truth had already done what no force could have accomplished. It had shifted the ground beneath every lie until there was nothing left for it to stand on. Caleb Voss felt every eye settle on him before a single word was spoken, and it was not the kind of attention a man could shake off with a smile or a quick explanation. It was heavier than that, slower, the kind that asked questions without giving him the chance to answer them the way he had before, and for the first time since sunrise he realized that the story he had told no longer belonged to him. It had moved beyond his reach, carried now by something steadier than fear. He cleared his throat, the sound dry, uneven, and stepped forward just enough to place himself where he thought a man should stand when he still believed he had something to defend. But the ground beneath that belief felt different now, less certain, as if it no longer agreed to hold him the way it had that morning. "I heard what I heard," he said, the words coming out thinner than he intended, lacking the sharp edge they once carried. And though he tried to meet the eyes of the townspeople, he found himself glancing away too quickly, searching for agreement that no longer came as easily. A few men shifted where they stood, boots scraping lightly against the dirt, not stepping away from him, not yet, but no longer stepping toward him either, and that small distance spoke louder than any accusation. The woman did not respond immediately, did not raise her voice or challenge him. She simply watched, her expression unchanged, as if she had already heard every version of this moment in her mind and knew which parts would fall apart on their own. Elias remained still beside her, the joined pendant resting in his hand, his gaze steady, not pressing, not demanding, but not turning away either. And there was something in that quiet that made it harder for Caleb to continue, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to argue with, only the presence of something that did not need to prove itself. "You expect us to believe this," Caleb tried again, gesturing toward the pendant with a motion that lacked conviction. "That this means he is innocent of what I said." The words hung there, but they did not land the way he wanted, because even as he spoke them, the certainty behind them had begun to fade, replaced by a doubt he could not quite force back into place. The woman took one step forward, not closing the distance in a threatening way, but enough to shift the focus of the moment once more, and when she spoke again her voice carried the same calm weight, steady, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed to match her pace. "You did not hear truth," she said, each word placed carefully. "You heard what fear sounds like when it needs a reason." There was no anger in her tone, no accusation sharpened into a blade, just a statement that settled into the space between them and stayed there, impossible to ignore. Caleb opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came, because the simplicity of what she said left no space to twist it into something else. And for a moment he stood there with nothing but the sound of his own breath, louder now than it should have been. Behind him, someone spoke quietly, not to him, but to the man beside them, a low voice carrying doubt where there had once been agreement, and that doubt spread, subtle but steady, like a crack forming in something that had seemed solid just hours before. Elias finally moved again, not toward Caleb, not toward the town, but down, kneeling briefly to press the pendant into the ground where the barn had stood, not burying it, not hiding it, just placing it there as if returning something to where it belonged. And when he stood back up, his hands were empty, open at his sides, showing nothing, holding nothing, and somehow that made the moment heavier than if he had reached for anything at all. The riders behind the woman remained silent, but one by one, without signal, they shifted slightly in their saddles, not advancing, not retreating, just adjusting in a way that made their presence feel more defined, more real, as if reminding the town that they were not a distant idea, not a rumor, but something that had come with purpose and would not leave without it being understood. Caleb felt that shift too, felt it in the way the air seemed to press closer around him, and he took another step back, this time aware of it, aware that every movement he made was being seen in a way it had not been before. And for the first time he realized that there was no path forward that allowed him to stand where he had stood at the beginning of the day. "I did what I thought was right," he said finally, quieter now, the words less a defense and more a reach for something that might still hold him up. But even as he said it, the weight of what had been lost settled in, not just the barn, not just the horses, but the trust of a town that had followed him without question and now stood unsure of what to believe. The woman did not answer that either, because she did not need to, and Elias did not speak, because there was nothing left that required his voice. And in that shared silence the truth had already done its work, not through force, not through fear, but through something far more difficult to escape, the simple, undeniable presence of what had always been there, waiting to be seen. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the street until even the smallest movements seemed to carry meaning. And in that stillness something shifted that no one could take back, not with words, not with pride, not with anything they had relied on before. One of the older men near the well removed his hat slowly, not out of habit, not out of respect for any single person, but because the weight of the moment asked for it. And he looked toward Elias with eyes that had seen enough years to recognize when something had gone wrong long before anyone admitted it. Another followed, then another, not in unison, not as a show, but as a quiet acknowledgement that what had been done could not be explained away as easily as it had been carried out. Caleb Voss stood in the center of it, feeling that shift passed through the town like a current he could not stand against, and for the first time he understood that this was not about proving himself right anymore. It was about whether he could stand still long enough to face what had been wrong. His shoulders lowered, just slightly, but enough that the tension he had been holding all day began to slip, and when he looked at Elias again, there was no longer an argument waiting in his eyes, only something closer to uncertainty, something that had not been there when the fire first started. He began, then stopped, the word falling short of anything that could carry the weight of what needed to be said, and in that unfinished moment the truth became clearer than any statement could have made it. Elias did not step forward to meet him, did not demand an answer, did not even change the way he stood, because whatever was happening now did not belong to him to force. It belonged to those who had chosen to act without knowing, and now had to decide what they would do with knowing. The woman turned slightly, her gaze moving across the faces of the town, not searching for guilt, not assigning blame, but seeing, truly seeing, each person as they stood there, and when she spoke again it was softer than before, almost carried by the wind rather than pushed against it. "Justice is not something you take," she said, her voice steady. "It is something you return." The words settled differently than anything else had, not heavy, not sharp, but final, in a way that did not need to be repeated. A man near the edge of the street took a step forward, hesitant at first, then more certain, his boots leaving clear marks in the dust as he moved toward the burned ground. And without looking at anyone for approval, he bent down and picked up a charred piece of wood, holding it for a moment before setting it carefully to the side, as if beginning something he did not yet know how to finish. Another joined him, then another, until a small line formed without direction, without command, each person moving in their own time, their own way, but all toward the same place. The same quiet understanding that what had been broken could not remain that way if they intended to stand on any ground that still meant something. Caleb watched them, his breath slow, uneven, and after a long moment he stepped forward too, not to lead, not to correct, but simply to be among them. And when he reached the edge of the blackened earth, he hesitated only once before bending down, his hand hovering over the ash before finally touching it, the fine dust marking his skin in a way that did not wash away as easily as he might have hoped. Elias observed it all without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was something in the way his shoulders settled, something in the quiet release of tension that had been held not out of fear but out of patience, that suggested he understood what this meant even if he did not speak it. The riders remained where they were, still mounted, still silent, but their presence no longer felt like a question waiting to be answered. It felt like something witnessing an answer already being given. The woman stepped back toward them, not turning away from Elias until the last moment, and when she did there was a small nod, not formal, not ceremonial, but enough to carry everything that had passed between them without needing to be said again. Elias inclined his head in return, just once, the gesture simple, unforced, and then he looked back at the land before him, at the people now moving through it with a different kind of care, and for the first time since the smoke had risen there was something in the air that did not feel like loss. It felt like the beginning of something that did not need to be announced, only continued. The sun dipped lower, the lights softening across Dust Hollow, and as the first boards were set aside, as the first small spaces were cleared, the sound of hooves behind them began to fade, not hurried, not loud, just steady, carrying the riders back across the ridge from where they had come, leaving behind not fear, not threat, but a silence that now belonged to the town itself and what they chose to do with it. By the time the last echo of hooves disappeared beyond the ridge, the town no longer sounded the same, not because it had grown louder, but because the silence left behind had changed shape, no longer heavy with accusation, no longer stretched tight with fear, but settled into something quieter, something that asked more than it answered. Elias Turner stood where he had always stood, not at the center of attention, not at the edge of it either, just present in a way that did not demand to be seen, yet could no longer be ignored. And as the townspeople moved around the blackened remains of what had once been his barn, he watched without stepping in, without correcting, without guiding, because what they were doing now was not for him to direct. It was something they had to choose on their own. The man who had first picked up the chard would now carried it toward a growing pile off to the side, placing it down with care that would have seemed unnecessary just hours before. And when he straightened his back, there was a pause in his movement, a moment where he glanced toward Elias, not expecting acknowledgement, not asking for it, but offering something unspoken all the same. Elias gave a small nod, barely noticeable, but enough to be seen by the man who needed to see it, and that was all that passed between them. No words, no forgiveness spoken aloud, just an understanding that did not need to be named. Caleb Voss remained near the edge of the burned ground longer than the others, his hands marked with ash, his posture uncertain, as if he had not yet decided whether he belonged among those who were now trying to rebuild or somewhere else entirely, somewhere further away from what he had set in motion. He looked down at his hands, turning them slightly as though the fine black dust might reveal something if he studied it long enough. But it did not change, did not disappear. It simply stayed, a quiet reminder that some things linger longer than expected. A boy, no older than 12, walked past him carrying a small plank, his steps careful, deliberate, and when he noticed Caleb standing still, he slowed just slightly, not out of fear, not out of respect, but out of something else, something closer to curiosity, as if he were seeing the man for the first time, without the weight of the morning's words shaping his view. Caleb met the boy's eyes for a brief second, then looked away, the moment passing without comment, but leaving something behind that he could not quite shake. The sun had nearly set now, the light stretching thin across the land, casting long shadows that blended together until it became difficult to tell where one ended and another began. And in that fading light, the outlines of the barn slowly shifted from ruin to possibility, from something that had been taken to something that might, with time, be restored. Elias took a step forward at last, not to lead, not to take control, but simply to join. And when he bent down to lift a beam that had been too heavy for one man alone, another set of hands reached in beside his without hesitation, then another, until the weight was shared without anyone needing to say so. They lifted together, steady, coordinated in a way that had nothing to do with planning and everything to do with intention. And when they set it down in a place where it could be used again, no one spoke, but the act itself carried more meaning than any apology could have held. Caleb watched that, his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with fear now. And after a long moment, he stepped forward once more, slower this time, more deliberate, and he reached for a piece of timber that lay half buried beneath ash, his hands hesitating only briefly before closing around it, the rough surface grounding him in a way he had not expected. He lifted it, not easily, not with confidence, but with effort that showed, and as he carried it toward the others, there was no one who stopped him, no one who turned him away, because whatever place he had in this moment was not something they would assign to him. It was something he would have to find by what he chose to do next. Elias glanced toward him as he approached, their eyes meeting for just a second, and in that brief exchange there was no judgment, no approval, just a quiet acknowledgement that the next step belonged to Caleb alone. The first stars began to appear overhead, faint at first, then clearer as the last of the daylight faded, and under that wide-open sky the work continued, slow, steady, unremarkable to anyone passing by, but to those who stood within it, it carried a weight that would not be forgotten easily. The land did not change in a single evening, and neither did the people upon it, but something had shifted, something small and quiet and lasting, and as the night settled over Dust Hollow, it did so not with the heaviness of what had been done, but with the quiet promise of what might be done differently when morning came. The night settled slowly over Dust Hollow, not with darkness alone, but with a kind of quiet that felt earned rather than imposed, and under that wide sky the work did not stop. It softened, it slowed, but it continued in small movements that mattered more than they appeared to from a distance. A lantern was lit near the edge of the burned ground, then another, their warm glow cutting through the dimness in steady circles, casting long shadows of men and women who only hours before had stood on opposite sides of something they did not fully understand. Now they moved together, not speaking much, not needing to, the sound of wood being set down, of boots shifting in the dirt, of quiet breath in the cool air, filling the space where anger had once lived. Elias Turner worked among them without stepping ahead, without stepping back, his presence blending into the rhythm of the task, lifting, setting, adjusting, as though this was simply another evening and not the aftermath of something that had nearly broken more than timber. From time to time, his gaze would lift toward the horizon, not searching for the riders, not expecting their return, but acknowledging the direction from which they had come, as if part of the story still stretched out there beyond what could be seen. Caleb Voss kept to the outer edge at first, carrying what he could, placing it down where it was needed, but never quite stepping fully into the center of the work, not because anyone kept him out, but because he had not yet decided how to stand inside it. His movements were careful, almost measured, as though each action required more thought than it should have, and when he paused it was not from fatigue, but from something else, something heavier, something that did not lift easily once it had settled in. Near the well, the older man who had removed his hat earlier sat on the low edge of the stone, watching the slow progress with eyes that had seen towns rise and fall on smaller things than this, and after a while he spoke, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, but enough for those nearby to hear. "A man's word builds more than wood," he said, his voice rough but steady, "and it can tear down just as much." No one answered him, not because they disagreed, but because there was nothing to add that would make it clearer. The words found their place on their own. The boy from earlier returned with another plank, this one longer, heavier, and he struggled with it for a moment before someone stepped in to help, their hands meeting the weight together without a word. And in that simple act, there was something that felt more solid than anything built that day. Elias noticed it, the way the boy adjusted his grip, the way he did not let go even when the strain showed. And there was the faintest hint of something in Elias's expression, something close to approval, though it never settled fully into a smile. Time moved differently now, slower, stretched between each small decision, each quiet act, until the night was no longer something that pressed down, but something that held the town in place long enough for it to change direction. Caleb finally stopped near the edge of the cleared space, his hands resting at his sides, the ash still faintly visible against his skin despite the work he had done, and he looked toward Elias, not expecting the man to notice, but finding that he did. Their eyes met again, and this time Caleb did not look away immediately. He held the moment, just long enough to say something without words, something uncertain, something unfinished, and Elias gave the smallest nod in return, not absolution, not forgiveness spoken aloud, but permission perhaps, or maybe just acknowledgement that the road ahead was still there if Caleb chose to walk it. A breeze moved through the valley, carrying the scent of wood and earth and something cleaner beneath it, and the lantern flames flickered but did not go out, holding steady against the movement as if they too had decided to remain. One by one, people began to step back from the work, not because it was finished, but because enough had been done for one night, enough to change the shape of what remained, enough to prove that something different had begun. The piles of salvaged wood stood where there had been only ruin, the ground cleared in places where it had been covered in ash, and though no structure stood yet, the outline of one had begun to form in the minds of those who had stayed. Elias remained a little longer, his hands resting lightly on a beam that would one day stand upright again, and he looked out over what had been done, not measuring it, not judging it, just seeing it for what it was. Behind him, Caleb turned to leave, taking a few slow steps before stopping once more, glancing back at the land, at the people, at the man who had not asked for any of it, and yet had stood through all of it without turning away. And for a moment Caleb seemed to consider something that did not yet have a name, before he continued on into the darkened street. The stars spread wider overhead, the town settling beneath them, and in that quiet, something lasting took root, not loud, not visible all at once, but steady, like the kind of change that does not need to be announced to be real. Morning came without announcement, just a slow wash of pale light stretching over the land until the shapes of things returned one by one. First the outline of the hills, then the scattered rooftops of Dust Hollow, and finally the darkened frame of what had once been Elias Turner's barn, now standing as something between memory and beginning. The air carried a chill that lingered close to the ground, and when Elias stepped out onto the open stretch where he had stood the day before, his boots pressed into earth that no longer felt as heavy as it had, though the marks of what happened remained clear in every line of ash and every piece of wood set aside with care. He paused there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but as if measuring the quiet, listening for something that did not need to be heard out loud. Behind him, the first sounds of the town waking began to rise, a door opening, a bucket set down, the low murmur of voices that had not yet decided how to carry themselves into a new day. It did not take long before footsteps approached, not rushed, not cautious, just steady. And when Elias turned slightly, he saw the same boy from the night before, carrying a small hammer in one hand and a handful of nails in the other, his face set with a kind of determination that did not belong to someone his age, but had found him anyway. He stopped a few feet away, shifting his weight once before speaking, his voice quiet but clear. "I figured you might need this." Elias looked at the tools, then at the boy, and gave a nod that carried more meaning than the simple exchange required. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, and used to being needed in that way. The boy nodded back, then stepped closer, not waiting to be told where to stand, simply finding a place beside the cleared space where the first beam had been set the night before. It did not take long for others to follow. One by one, then in twos and threes, the townspeople returned, some carrying tools, some bringing what materials they could spare, others with nothing in their hands but a willingness to stand where work needed to be done. No one made a speech. No one called it anything. They simply began. Elias worked among them again. But this time there was a difference, not in what he did, but in how the others moved around him, not as if they were correcting something, but as if they were building something together, something that belonged to all of them in a way that did not need to be spoken. The first upright beam went into place just as the sun cleared the ridge, its light catching along the edge of the wood, turning something ordinary into something that held the eye for a moment longer than expected. Hands steadied it, adjusted it, secured it, and when it stood on its own, there was a brief pause, not for applause, not for acknowledgement, but simply because the act itself marked a line between what had been and what was beginning. Caleb Voss did not arrive with the others. For a time, it seemed as though he might not come at all, and a few people noticed, though no one said anything, because whatever place he had now was not theirs to define. It was nearly mid-morning when he appeared at the far end of the road, walking instead of riding, his coat draped over one arm, his pace unhurried but deliberate, as if each step had been chosen before it was taken. He did not look toward the barn at first. He looked at the ground, at the dust, at the faint tracks left behind by the riders who had come and gone, and then, slowly, he lifted his gaze. The work did not stop when he approached. No one turned him away. No one called his name. The space simply made room for him the same way it had for everyone else. He stood there for a moment, taking it in, the new frame, the people moving around it, Elias among them, steady as before, and something in Caleb's expression shifted again, not as sharply as it had the day before, but enough to show that whatever he had been holding on to was loosening its grip. He stepped forward, stopping a few feet from Elias, and for a moment it seemed as though he might speak, might try to find the words that had failed him before, but instead he did something simpler. He set his coat aside, rolled up his sleeves, and reached for a length of timber lying near the edge of the work. It was not a grand gesture. It did not erase anything, but it was real. Elias noticed him, just briefly, and gave the same small nod he had given the boy, no more, no less, and that was enough. The work continued, the structure rising piece by piece, each beam set with care, each nail driven with intention, until the shape of the barn began to return, not as it had been, but as something new, built not from what had been lost, but from what had been learned. The sun climbed higher, the light stronger now, casting fewer shadows, and under that steady brightness the town moved forward, not forgetting, not pretending, but carrying what had happened in a way that did not weigh them down the same way it had before. And somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen but not forgotten, the silence that had come with the riders remained, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a reminder that truth does not need to arrive loudly to be heard. It only needs to arrive at the right time. By noon, the frame of the barn stood tall enough to cast its own shadow again, long and clean across the packed dirt. And for the first time since the fire, there was a shape that promised shelter instead of loss, a line against the sky that meant something would stand here again, not because it had always been there, but because people had chosen to raise it back up. The sound of hammers settled into a steady rhythm, not loud, not hurried, but consistent, each strike carrying intention rather than urgency. And the smell of fresh cut wood began to replace the last trace of smoke that had lingered in the air since the day before. Elias Turner worked near the center beam, his movements precise, efficient, as though he had done this 100 times before, and in a way he had. Not this exact moment, not with these exact people, but the act of building, of putting things back into place with his own hands, had always been part of who he was long before any of this began. The boy stayed close, passing nails when needed, holding pieces steady when asked, though most of the time he anticipated without being told, learning the rhythm as he went, and every now and then he would glance up at Elias, not for approval, but for understanding, as if trying to read something that could not be explained in words. Elias never said much, but when he did it was enough, a short instruction, a quiet correction, and once, a simple, "that will hold," spoken in a way that made the boy stand a little straighter, as though those 3 words carried more weight than a full speech ever could. Around them, the town moved in quiet cooperation, each person finding a place where their hands were useful, where their effort could add something real to what was taking shape, and the work grew not in bursts, but in layers, each piece set with care so that the next could rest on it without doubt. Caleb Voss worked on the far side at first, measuring boards, cutting where needed, his movements still deliberate, still careful, but no longer hesitant in the same way they had been the night before. And as the hours passed, he moved closer to the center without announcing it, simply following where the work required him to be. No one commented on it. No one needed to. The shift was seen, and that was enough. At one point, he found himself holding a beam in place while Elias secured it, their hands working within inches of each other. And for a brief moment the past day seemed to hang between them, not spoken, not pushed aside, just present, acknowledged without needing to be named. When the beam settled into place, Elias gave a small nod, the same one he had given before, and Caleb returned it, not fully, not with confidence, but with something that resembled acceptance, as though he had stopped trying to decide what he deserved and had begun to focus on what he could do. The older man by the well had come closer now, not working as quickly as the others, but steady in his own way, carrying smaller pieces, setting them down where they were needed, and from time to time he would pause, looking over the structure as it rose, his eyes tracing the lines as though measuring not just the wood, but the change within the people building it. "Takes more than nails to hold something together," he said once, not looking at anyone in particular, and a few nearby glanced toward him, then back to their work, the meaning understood without needing to be repeated. The sun climbed higher, the heat settling in, and sweat marked the effort now, darkening shirts, tracing lines down dust-covered skin, but no one stepped away for long, no one complained, because the work itself had become something more than labor. It had become a way to move forward without needing to say that was what they were doing. Elias paused once, stepping back to look at the structure, his eyes moving from one beam to the next, checking, measuring, not just the strength of it, but the way it stood, the way it held its shape. And for a moment there was something in his expression that suggested quiet satisfaction, not pride, not relief, but something close to it, something that had been missing and was now returning piece by piece. Caleb noticed it, that small shift, and it stayed with him longer than he expected, settling into a place he had not yet fully understood, but could not ignore either. The boy wiped his hands on his shirt and looked up at the rising frame, his eyes following the lines upward, and he smiled, just slightly, as if seeing something that would stand long after he left, something he had been part of in a way that mattered. The wind moved through the valley again, lighter now, carrying the scent of fresh wood and open earth, and the sound it made against the new structure was different from before, no longer passing through empty space, but brushing against something that answered back, something that held. And in that sound, quiet as it was, there was a kind of promise, not spoken, not guaranteed, but present all the same, that what had been set right here would not be so easily undone again. The afternoon light began to lean westward, stretching longer shadows across the rising structure, and with it came a subtle slowing of movement, not from exhaustion alone, but from the quiet understanding that something important had already been set in place, something that would not be undone by the setting of the sun. The frame now stood strong enough to hold its own shape without constant support. Each beam connected, each joint tightened with care, and when the wind passed through it, it no longer whispered through emptiness. It moved around something solid, something that answered back with a low, steady sound that felt almost like breath. Elias Turner stood near the center, one hand resting briefly against a vertical post, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood, as if confirming what his eyes already knew, that this would hold, that this would stand through. More than just the next season. He stepped back, giving space to those still working along the outer edges, adjusting, securing, refining, the smaller tasks that often carried the most weight when it came to whether something endured or failed when no one was watching. The boy had climbed onto a low beam, balancing carefully as he passed tools down to a man below, his movements more confident now, less tentative, shaped by the rhythm he had learned over the course of the day, and when he nearly lost his footing once, a hand reached up to steady him without hesitation, without comment, and he nodded his thanks before continuing, as though that kind of support had already become expected. Caleb Voss worked closer now than he had at any point before, his hands moving with more certainty, the hesitation that once marked each action replaced by something steadier, something that came not from forgetting, but from choosing to remain present despite remembering. He paused only once, wiping his hands against his shirt, leaving faint streaks that would not come clean easily, and he looked toward Elias again, not searching for approval this time, but acknowledging something that had changed between them, something that no longer needed to be measured or questioned. Elias met his gaze for a moment, then looked back to the work, and that was enough. Near the edge of the site, a woman who had said little throughout the day began organizing the remaining pieces of wood into neat stacks, separating what could be used immediately from what would need shaping, her movements methodical, precise, and though no one had asked her to do it, her work brought a quiet order to the space that had been missing, turning scattered remnants into something that could be understood, something that could be used. The older man approached her, nodding once as he set a smaller piece beside her stack, and for a brief moment they worked side by side without speaking, their shared silence carrying more agreement than words ever could. The sun dipped lower, its light now softer, casting a golden hue across the wood that made the structure seem warmer than it had any right to be, and for a moment, those who paused to look could see not just what stood before them, but what it would become, a place of shelter, of work, of quiet evenings and early mornings, a place that would hold more than just animals and tools, but the memory of how it had been built and why. Elias stepped away from the center again, walking slowly along the perimeter, his eyes moving over each section, not with suspicion, not with doubt, but with care, and when he found a joint that needed tightening, he reached for it without calling attention, adjusting it with practiced ease before moving on, leaving no sign except that it had been done right. Caleb noticed that too, the way Elias moved through the work without claiming it, without directing it, simply ensuring that it would last, and something in that quiet dedication settled deeper in him than any words could have reached. The sound of hammers began to fade as fewer tasks remained, replaced by the softer sounds of wood being set into place, of tools being gathered, of people stepping back to see what had been done. No one announced the end of the day. It came naturally, as the light thinned and the air cooled, as the need to continue gave way to the understanding that enough had been accomplished for now. Elias stood once more at the front of the structure, looking up at the beams that now crossed overhead, forming the beginning of a roof that would soon follow, and for a long moment he said nothing, did nothing, simply stood there, his presence steady, his silence full. Behind him, the town began to disperse, not all at once, not with any sense of finality, but gradually, as people gathered their tools, exchanged small nods, and stepped away, leaving behind something they had helped shape with their own hands. Caleb lingered a moment longer, his eyes moving over the structure, then to Elias, then back again, and though he did not speak, There was something in the way he stood that suggested he understood now that what had been built here was more than wood and nails. It was a measure of something that could not be taken back, but could be carried forward. The wind moved again, brushing against the new frame, and this time the sound it made was not empty, not uncertain, but full, steady, and grounded, like something that had found its place and intended to keep it. The evening returned with a softer edge this time, not pressing down on the town, but settling gently over it, as if even the sky understood that something had shifted and did not need to be forced into silence again. The structure stood where ruin had been, its frame catching the last light of day in long, clean lines, and though it was not yet complete, it held itself with a quiet certainty that did not depend on what had come before. Elias Turner remained near the front, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and for a long moment he simply looked at what had been built, not counting the beams, not measuring the work, but seeing the people behind it, the hands that had chosen to stay, the ones that had returned when they could have walked away. One by one, the townspeople drifted closer again, not to work this time, but to stand, to look, to let the shape of it settle into their understanding, and there was a stillness among them that felt different from the silence of the day before, this one carrying no weight of accusation, only the quiet recognition of what had been done together. The boy stood a few feet from Elias, his small hammer still in his hand, though he no longer needed it, his eyes moving up along the beams with something close to pride, though he did not name it as such, and when he glanced toward Elias again, he found the man already looking, not at him directly, but in his direction, and that was enough. Caleb Voss approached more slowly this time, his steps measured, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as though he understood now that how he moved mattered in ways it had not before. He stopped beside Elias, not too close, not distant either, just within reach of being heard if either of them chose to speak. For a moment, neither did. The air between them held the memory of what had passed, but it no longer pressed in the same way. It simply existed, waiting to see what would be done with it. Caleb cleared his throat, the sound quieter than it had been before, less an attempt to take control and more a sign that he was choosing to step forward without knowing exactly where it would lead. "I cannot change what I said," he began, his voice steady, but low, not meant for the whole town, only for the man beside him, "and I cannot pretend it did not matter." He paused there, not searching for a way to make it smaller, not trying to shift the weight elsewhere, just letting the truth stand where it was. Elias did not turn immediately, did not respond in a way that would close the space too quickly, and when he finally looked at Caleb, there was no judgment in his eyes, no demand, only a steady presence that allowed the moment to remain what it was. Caleb continued, the words coming more clearly now, not because they were easier, but because he had stopped trying to shape them into something they were not. "But I can stand here now," he said, "and I can make sure what I do next is not built the same way." The sentence settled between them, simple, unadorned, and for a moment it seemed as though nothing would follow it, that it would simply remain there as it was. Elias held his gaze, then gave a small nod, the same one he had given before, unchanged, consistent, and in that single motion there was something that allowed the air to move again, something that did not erase what had been done, but made space for what could come after. Around them, the town remained quiet, not out of discomfort, but out of respect for the moment unfolding without spectacle, without need for attention. The older man stepped closer, his hat now resting back on his head, and he looked from one to the other before speaking in that same rough, steady voice. "A man is not only what he does once," he said, "but what he keeps doing after." He did not wait for a reply, did not linger, simply let the words fall where they would and stepped back again, leaving them to settle on their own. The boy shifted his weight, then stepped forward just slightly, looking up at the structure again, then back at Elias, and he spoke without hesitation, his voice clear in the cooling air. "It is going to stand," he said. Elias followed his gaze upward, his eyes tracing the lines of the beams now outlined against the fading light, and after a moment, he answered simply, "Yes." The word carried no certainty beyond what could be seen, no promise beyond what had been built, but it was enough. The sun dipped lower, the sky turning softer, deeper, and as the first hints of night returned, the town did not retreat in the same way it had before. Some remained, some left, but none did so with the weight they had carried the day before, because something had been set right, not completely, not perfectly, but honestly, and that made all the difference. Elias stayed a while longer, his hand resting once more against the wood, feeling its strength, its steadiness, and when he finally stepped back, turning toward the path that led away from the barn, he did so without looking back again, because he no longer needed to check if it would hold. It already did. The night deepened, but it no longer carried the same uncertainty it once had. Instead, it settled over Dust Hollow like a blanket that had finally found its place, quiet but not heavy, still but not empty. And beneath it the town breathed in a way that felt different, slower, steadier, as if something inside it had realigned without anyone needing to call attention to it. Elias Turner walked the familiar path away from the barn, his boots pressing into the dirt with the same rhythm they always had. But the ground beneath them no longer felt like it belonged only to him. It carried the imprint of many now, layered, shared, and though he did not turn back, he did not need to, because the sound of the place behind him had already changed, and that was enough. The structure stood under the dim glow of lanterns left hanging along its frame, their light swaying slightly in the breeze, casting moving shadows across the beams that had been set with such care, and those shadows did not feel like remnants of what had been lost. They felt like proof of what had been built. Near the edge of the worksite, Caleb Voss remained longer than most, his figure half lit by the lantern glow, his posture quieter now, less defined by the need to stand a certain way and more by the simple act of staying. He had not followed Elias, had not called out to him, because whatever needed to be said between them had already been placed where it belonged, and what remained was not something that could be forced into words without losing its meaning. Instead, Caleb turned back toward the structure, stepping closer, his hand reaching out to touch one of the beams, not testing it, not measuring it, just resting there for a moment, as if grounding himself in something that would not shift beneath him the way his own choices had. The older man approached again, slower now, his movements measured by years rather than urgency, and he stood beside Caleb without speaking at first, both of them looking at the same line of wood stretching upward into the night sky. "It is a strange thing," the older man said after a while, his voice low, almost thoughtful, "how a place can change without moving at all." Caleb let the words settle before answering, his voice quieter than it had ever been since he first rode into town. "Or how a man can," he replied, not looking away from the beam beneath his hand. The older man gave a small nod, not approving, not dismissing, just acknowledging that the thought had been spoken aloud, and after a moment he stepped away, leaving Caleb alone again with the structure and whatever it now represented. Across the town, small lights flickered to life in windows and along porches, each one marking a place where people had returned to their own spaces, carrying with them the memory of the day, not as something to dwell on, but as something that would quietly shape what came next. The boy lingered near the barn a little longer, sitting on a low beam with his hammer resting across his knees, his gaze fixed upward as though trying to imagine the roof that would soon cover the open frame. And after a while he stood, brushing dust from his clothes, and walked home without looking back, not because he had forgotten, but because he trusted it would be there in the morning. Elias reached his cabin as the night settled fully, the familiar creak of the door greeting him the same way it always had, unchanged, steady, and inside. The quiet was different too, not empty, not isolating, but filled with the sense that the world outside had shifted in a way that would reach even here, even into the spaces that had once been defined by distance. He set his hat down, moved through the room without turning on a light, and for a moment he stood near the window, looking out toward where the barn stood beyond the dark, unseen but present in a way that did not require sight. His hand rested briefly on the edge of the table, fingers still carrying the faint roughness of the day's work, and there was a stillness in him that did not come from exhaustion, but from something closer to completion, not of the structure, not of the events that had led to it, but of a turning point that had not needed to be marked with anything more than quiet action. Outside, the wind moved once more through the valley, brushing against the new frame, passing through the town, carrying with it the scent of fresh wood and open earth, and this time, nothing resisted it, nothing stood against it. It simply moved, steady and unbroken, like the kind of truth that does not need to be spoken twice. And somewhere between the beams that now stood where ashes had been, and the man who had chosen to stand through it all without raising his voice, something settled into place that would not be easily undone, not because it was strong, but because it was honest, and out here, that was the only thing that ever truly held. Morning returned again, not as a repetition of what had already happened, but as something quieter, steadier, like a page turned without sound, and the first light of it touched the frame of the barn in a way that made it look complete even before it truly was, the beams catching gold along their edges, the lines standing straight against the open sky as if they had always belonged there. Elias Turner stepped out into that light the same way he always did, unhurried, unannounced, his boots finding the path without needing to look, and when he reached the open ground where the structure stood, he paused, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when something once broken has been returned not to what it was, but to what it can be. The town had not gathered yet, not in numbers, not in movement, but there were signs that it would, a door left open longer than usual, a figure already walking down the road with purpose instead of habit, small things that spoke of change without naming it. Elias moved closer to the frame, his hand lifting to rest once more against the wood, feeling its firmness, its steadiness, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not in reflection, not in memory, but in a simple acknowledgement that this would hold. Behind him, footsteps approached, light, quick, and familiar, and the boy arrived with the same hammer, though now it rested easier in his grip, less like something borrowed and more like something earned. He did not speak right away, just stood beside Elias, looking up at the beams, his eyes tracing the shape of what would soon be finished, and after a moment he said quietly, "We can finish it today." Elias opened his eyes, followed the line of the structure upward, then gave a small nod. "Yes," he said, the same word as before, unchanged, but this time it carried something more, not certainty alone, but completion waiting just ahead. The town came slowly after that, not as a crowd, but as individuals choosing the same direction, and with them came the tools, the boards, the quiet understanding that what had been started would be seen through, not because it had to be, but because it mattered that it was. Caleb Voss arrived among them, not early, not late, just when the work was ready for him, his sleeves already rolled, his hands no longer clean, and when he stepped into the space there was no hesitation left in his movement, no searching for where he belonged. He simply found the work and joined it. No one stopped to notice. No one needed to. The roof began to take shape under steady hands, each plank lifted and set, each nail driven with care, the sound of it echoing lightly across the open land, not loud, not sharp, but consistent, like a rhythm that had found its place and intended to keep it. Elias moved through the work without directing it, his presence enough to guide without command, and when something needed adjusting, it was done. When something needed holding, it was held, each action fitting into the next until the structure rose into something complete. The older man stood back this time, watching more than working, his hands resting on the top of his cane, his eyes following the final pieces as they were set into place, and when the last board slid into position and was secured, there was no shout, no cheer, just a quiet stillness as everyone stepped back, taking in what stood before them. The barn was whole again. Not the same, not untouched, but standing. Elias stood at the front once more, his gaze moving across the finished lines, the solid frame, the roof that now held the sky at a distance, and for a long moment he said nothing, did nothing, just stood there with the kind of stillness that did not ask for recognition. Caleb stood a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the same structure, and after a moment he stepped forward, stopping beside Elias, not speaking, not reaching out, just standing there, and in that shared silence there was something understood that did not need to be said. The boy stepped up onto the lowest beam, looking out over the town from that small height, his face bright with something simple and honest, and he tapped the wood lightly with his hammer as if testing it one last time, then nodded to himself, satisfied. The people began to drift away after that, not quickly, not all at once, but gradually, each one carrying the moment with them in their own way, leaving behind a place that would hold more than just what it was built for. Elias remained a while longer, his hand resting briefly against the doorframe before he turned away, his steps steady as he walked back toward his cabin, not looking over his shoulder, not needing to. Because out here, justice had not come with noise, had not come with force. It had come quietly, in the space between what was said and what was true, in the hands that chose to build instead of turn away, in the silence that allowed a man to stand without raising his voice. And that was enough.